So I have the awkward pleasure of introducing myself. For those of you who know this forum, I normally don't present other than to fill in the gaps of all the people who are sick or away and can't do their own presentations. And it's an awful thing to try and do because you never really know the work that well. And I would never give myself a slot at the front and for longer than everyone else, but I've got one because Lizzie asked me to do it. And I'm going to try to talk a little bit about my work and managing biocultural landscapes, or thinking about biocultural landscapes, and particularly reflecting now that I have a strategic advisory role with the Conservation Ecology Centre, but I'm not directly employed by the Conservation Ecology Centre. I work as a research fellow at the University of Melbourne. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role that conservation ecology has played over the last 25 years, but I guess in particular last 12 or 15 odd years that I've been involved, because that's my memory. I wanted to put this up front and centre, and this is remembering our future, I guess the strategic vision of largely John Clark at Eastern Maar around how Eastern Maar consider their landscapes. And I think Ebony has articulated it really beautifully. And so I'm going to start a little bit by discussing what Ebony was talking about. This is the view south from Red Rock. And to the south, you can see the area of country that Kerrang is associated with snake. And to the northeast, the area Sherinallum, associated with sea tern, and to the northwest, I should say, and to the northeast is the volcanic plain Warreen, which is associated with this bandicoot being. And we've talked a little bit about Warreen and Dreeite Nature Conservation Reserve at this forum in the past, and I'll talk about it in a second. But I guess I always start with this analogy or this image because it places us in the landscape. It's not as good as being there, I guarantee you. It's not as cold or windy either, but it is a place where you can literally see the culturally significant entities that guided the management of that landscape for centuries. And that's really, I guess, important to understand that was the management template that the Maar, and in this instance the Gulingen, had for their landscape. And so it led to some work that we did at the Dreeite Nature Conservation Reserve, which we've talked about in a panel last year. This is the Nature Conservation Reserve. This is the eastern barred bandicoot, which no longer exists there. And this is a sediment core, the results on the left of the screen, stage left. That shows basically the sediment, the pollen in the deposition of the layers of sediment, showing as a decrease in fire since colonisation, an increase in shrubby and weedy species. I'm not going to go into this, it's not really what it's about, but basically Eastern Maar are now leading the management of the program of Dreeite Nature Conservation Reserve based on the expression of its culturally significant entities. I'm going to do something which I normally despise, which is I'm going to have to do some running repairs to the IT to, there's the plug, we'll work it out. You know, when academics do this and they stick their papers on the screen and it's really awkward. The reason I wanted to do it was because that top paper, we tried to write down I guess collectively several of the Eastern Maar people who'd been involved in developing that approach. As I said, John Clark really, I think, pushed forward the idea of the biocultural landscapes across Eastern Maar territory. You've heard Ebony's, I guess, cultural story about that landscape. And Marcus, the CEO, incorporated into that paper a whole lot of, let's call them rules of engagement of working with Eastern Maar. And there's an invitation there for researchers, land managers to work with Eastern Maar on their country. And it gives a bit of an idea of how people can approach it. I by no means think that it's Eastern Maar policy, but it certainly helps place it in its context and the work of others in the context of Eastern Maar's obligations to care for country. So you can find that paper in a collection of works published by CSIRO and Wildlife Research that I was a guest editor for, and I've now awkwardly put another publication on the screen, which was the editorial, which I lead authored, which is incredibly insightful. You should read it. Enough of that. What I really wanted to do, this is always the backdrop on my computer, and so I get asked about it a lot, so I thought I'd take an opportunity to talk to this story. And I wanted to use this as an example of what I mean by culturally significant entities. Before I dive into that, I want to make a bit of a warning. There's a real risk as we use Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous stories, particularly as we publish them, talk about them and use them in projects, that they become an academic discipline of their own and that academics use them in gatekeeping. And so I used the term culturally significant entities for a very specific reason. There was a body of work being built up by a colleague and friend of mine, Tegan Shields, Nee Gulmere, and she was doing her PhD looking at culturally significant entities. And at the absolute core of it, they're simply culturally significant places and species that traditional custodians of land have asserted their obligation to care for and an expectation that they have a role in doing so. And the reason that we pushed it hard, because I really do get concerned about, academics taking nomenclature and then it becomes a thing of their own, is because we had an opportunity to try and push it into some legislation. The EPBC Act, which is now on the agenda again, we didn't get there, but we had a fair shake at it. And to be honest, it raised the profile of thinking, so I think it was worthwhile. But now I'm going to tell you this yarn, which starts with this old fella when he was a real little boy. This is Uncle Max Harrison, who was the most significant cultural teacher in my life. He used to talk about our physical selves as the suitcase. He left his suitcase about 3 or 4 years ago during COVID. But when he was a little fella of 9 years old, he was taken out of school by these 4 old fellas who took him all over southeast coast, New South Wales, so all through Yuin country, down into Gunai country, and into the west, up into the high country. And he was initiated into the old ways of the law. He walked a lot of his country. He was extraordinary geographer in some ways. You could not get the old fella lost. You'd have been lost driving around back country for half a day and have been lost for several hours. And the old fella always knew exactly where he was. It was quite extraordinary because he had a different way of seeing the world. But when he was a little boy, they took him out to a place called Cathcart and they drew a picture in the sand for him. And they said to him, "Max, do you remember that story?" And he goes, "Yeah, I reckon." And so they went and they wiped it out. And they said, "In your life, you need to find that. It's down south." So it took him until he was 80. He eventually hooked up with a Palawa elder, Auntie Gloria, who had been the custodian of a site that she didn't understand all her life. And eventually Uncle Max heard rumours of this custodian of this site. And he went and talked to her. And she said, "Oh, I know this yarn. Everything makes sense." So he took her up to a place and he showed her, and she showed him basically the story he'd been taught as a little fella. Tasmania, Yuin country, south coast, New South Wales, fair distance. Not many Yuin people got down there ever. And what it shows is the story of Gurrwal. And this story is basically a story where in the beginning, the whales lived on land with the people and they were part of the same society, and they asked if they could go into Gadu, the ocean, to hold the law of the ocean. And the people decided that they could. The elders all decided that they could if they agreed to hold the law of the ocean in the same way the people would hold the law of the land. They agreed. And then this was happening and working, and then there was a time of great confusion. As Gadu, the sea, rose up, and we all know what happened around 10 to 15,000 years ago. And Gurrwal came to the people and led the people north by blowing bubbles. And the people in the Great Confusion and Ocean Rise followed the bubbles of Gurrewal to high country, and they were saved. And part of the conversation, Gurrewal was said, you'll have to go to a new piece of land where you know no one. You can offer the people that live there nothing, so you'll have to be going there with respect. So it teaches us a lot about connection. And that songline is a culturally significant entity to all of the people who share it, and it is a shared story up and down the east coast of Australia. And it talks to us about responsibility to each other. That's what I wanted to share about that. And the ground parrot is a culturally significant and identified species by the Eastern Maar people. And so I'm going to go and talk a little bit, and we've talked about this in previous forums, I'm going to go talk a little bit to what we're doing with this culturally significant species, the ground parrot. So this is the Carlisle Heath. From this point, you're standing in Gadabinod country looking southwest over the Jellybrand River, which is the cultural boundary with the Kirrarung, two of the language groups of the Greenwich Maar, or Eastern Maar. It was habitat for a long time for a significant population of ground parrots, but to the best of our knowledge, they're gone now. The last record in the Otways of the ground parrot was actually in Anglesey in 2015. They haven't been recorded in the Carlisle for a long time. It is a highly flammable system. In the 2020, February 2020, there was a fire that started in the Carlisle Heath that had a run at Jellybrand, which caused quite a bit of consternation, and part of Jellybrand was evacuated. And it was crowning at 2 a.m, pretty significant fire behaviour. And that's to do with the fact that there's a large proportion of Xanthorrhoea in the landscape, which is effectively a massive grass tussock and burns very, very well. So there's quite a lot of interest in managing the fieriness of the landscape for the protection of communities. This is the fire that started in, I want to say, I'm looking for Deakin people, but it was November, wasn't it, last year? November, the Yulong fire, which started effectively in the southern area of this dry, heathy landscape and made a run south. The reason I wanted to show you that is the green sections are planned burns that were conducted in the winter of 2023 and 2024. And you can see they've completely changed the potential shape of that fire. So we know that putting fire history into that landscape does, in fact, reduce the potential of fire spread. But we're not going to talk to you about fire hazard and stuff like that because we're here for this bird. Well, we're actually here for a lot of values. We've been researching this system for quite a long time. And we know that fire completely changes the system. They're incredibly flammable, and they are not apples and apples, pre and post burn. So a PhD student of mine, he was supposed to be finished 2 years ago, but he's not. You'll have seen him present here many times. His name is Mark Laplar. Many of you will know him. He just will not finish, but we love him, so we put up with it. I found my cord. What he showed was hazard reduction burns, and this is one in the orange. The green is the unburnt refugia that was left behind from a planned burn. And the bottom is literally a timeline of when these potaroos died after the fire. He published all about this. See, I'm really being a proper academic today, aren't I? He's also still preparing this manuscript, but basically what this shows is that the greater the amount, and I don't really do mathematics, I apologise, but what I want you to take home from this graph is that the highest proportion of a potaroo's home range, and he can tell that because we were tracking them with GPS collars, that burns, the less likely a potaroo is to survive. Good to know. Why is that? We're also radio tracking cats and foxes. This is a cat called Gaston. He named that cohort of cats after Disney characters. This is Gaston's home range before a burn. This is the orange bit is the burn, and red is Gaston's home range post the burn. I'm going to show you that again because unless you're looking at the dots, I want you to see where the dots go after the fire. So you can see that cat in particular, not only is it attracted into the burnt landscape, it's actually particularly focusing on the unburnt refugia, or what we'd consider the unburnt refugia in the landscape. It is targeting where the animals go to hide. So this is of great concern, right? We know that foxes and cats actually respond a little bit differently from the work that Mark did to the fires. Foxes particularly favoured the burnt landscape. We think that potoroos in particular didn't mind the way that vegetation had changed. It made foraging for fungus easier. They didn't all react the same, and they didn't all go immediately to a fire. They didn't travel very far to get to one, but if they came across one, that was when they in particular got there. It also showed that if a fire didn't go to a road edge, a predator was far less likely to find it and use that fire scar to hunt for creatures. So we were working in very close partnership. I was at the Conservation Ecology Centre at the time. We had University of Melbourne ecologists, and we were working with DECA and Parks Vic land managers, basically to design ways of doing fire differently to see if we could reduce the impact. In particular, there was a 10,000 hectare basically trial area where we could, based on conditions, quite flexibly choose where to go and burn under given conditions. We started often using an aerial drip torch to be very specific about where we're putting fire in a landscape as opposed to burning off road edges. And using fuel moisture differentials and things like shade, we were able to reduce the fire scar to be patchy within the scale of a potoroo's home range. And in one particular burn where we did this, survival rates after the fire were, in one particular one, all collared potoroos survived, and the results are far better, 20 to 40% compared to pre this type of fire, around about 80% mortality. So we know if we manipulate the way we do fire, we can have a good benefit for potoroos, which is good. But we're here to talk about ground parrots. They don't really like this xanthorrhea stuff. They actually live in button grass in particular, these low heaths where there's a lot of grains that they can access from the ground. Do come in, people, if you'd like to. Michael, you can come and sit at the front so I can get the thumb drive off you. But we had noticed that both the parrots had dropped out, fire history had changed. No longer were the cockies burning for green pick. No longer were parks burning in the Carlisle Heath to sort of manage fuel, but also keep it open for ground parrots. And basically the habitat had converted. And you can see the power line easement is a fantastic example of what these grassy heathlands looked like compared to directly adjacent. They became incredibly shrubby and were taken over by Melaleuca sclerosa largely. So we have an ecologist or a student of mine, Tamika Fairley-Lima, I'm hoping she's quicker than Mark, to come and have a look at what we could do about the domination of these heathlands by Melaleuca sclerosa. And she's developed a whole series of treatments across both the Carlisle Heath and the Cape Otway Heath of mechanical and fire treatments and combining them. So some of the sites have been burnt, some of them have been rolled and then burnt, and others have been mulched, so with the mulch-headed bobcat, to understand if we can reset the country and bring it back to a grassy sort of understory. This was the design, very clever. We need to resurvey in spring, so we don't have results for you. This is what some of the treatments look like. They can look a little drastic, but you can see the operator of the mulch-headed bobcat is quite a good operator. He's able to leave xanthorrheas that poke in through the wet heath. In the middle is burning the Melaleuca that's been rolled, and to the right is after it's been burnt. It doesn't look so drastic now. In fact, it looks even nicer than this. The button grass has come back. In some of the sites, so has the Melaleuca, but it is far smaller than it was. I think one of the take-homes is, and we don't have the results, but we are learning a lot, and that's really the point. is that we're learning collaboratively together. What we are noticing is, things respond pretty quickly to intervention. Don't get too hung up on reading the words on my slides. I never do. There does seem to be a difference in the sites based on the fire history that they've had prior to our intervention. So burns that have been more recent in the landscape before our treatments have actually had a more subduing effect on the Melaleuca recruitment or recovery, which is interesting and sort of lends itself to some of Tamika's thinking around if you have repeat interventions at certain times of year, you can start to starve these shrubby things that dominate. This is sort of where we're at. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Cape Otway Heath, where we're doing exactly the same thing. We had this beautifully designed project in Cape Otway doing exactly the same thing. And then in, what was it, like February this year, James? Was it February this year? We woke up and this was happening in the middle of our experiment. And we directed a bulldozer, in the midst of it to basically take advantage of all of these areas where we'd manipulated the habitat because it made it much easier for access. And it burnt this directly in the middle of the experiment, that dashed red stuff, which extraordinarily, and this will never happen again, burnt exactly the right number of treatments for the experiment to still work. I was directing that dozer and people were suspicious. I don't know, whatever. What I wanted to draw out, and Laura's going to speak to this after me, but Eastern Mara have developed a biocultural landscape for ground parrot country, a landscape vision. And the bit that I wanted to highlight, sorry Laura if this goes to the core of yours, but at the end there's a statement that says all the people who work to care for ground parrot country are connected to each other no matter what uniform they wear and are working together. Everyone working to care for ground parrot country is taking a biocultural approach that recognises the interconnection between ecosystems and human cultures. I don't know if we've got it yet, but I reckon we're on the way. Now I wanted to swivel a little bit to look at some of the Conservation Ecology Centre's programs and have a little bit of a think about some of those principles about working together and how effective it's been. So once again, please don't get too carried away by the words on the slides. I've literally just ripped some of James's from a previous presentation, sorry mate, and stuck them up there because that helps trigger my brain to talk about it. We had a really significant issue with pigs that was brewing there for a while, and it certainly hasn't gone away. But in particular, I was getting quite concerned. It took us a significant amount of money to raise money to actually try and address it. In that time, I thought it had taken us too long to raise the money, from going from several sort of pockets where we would often get pig detections to all of a sudden this sort of rapid expansion of the places in which we could expect to see pigs. So we decided to divide this project. We were lucky to receive some federal government funding through the Wild Otways Initiative into 3 different elements. So we called them intelligence, which is not something I naturally adhere to. But we did a few things. We had GPS tracking collars to try and understand the movement ecology, camera grids to try and understand the actual population densities. We tried things like, eDNA, infrared. And we basically designed all of our intelligence and data gathering so that we could more effectively do the control. And by doing that, we learnt that boars would travel very long distances to visit all of their girlfriends, and they would tell us where their girls were living. A disservice to their society, but it made controlling them very easy, or simpler. I shouldn't say very easy. We used remotely triggered cage traps, and we were able to, because we knew through the camera grids, we knew every individual pig in a population or a subpopulation. We were able to get entire mobs and remove them in one go based on the information that we had. But by far the most important bit, and I sort of think of this type of work in conservation land management, caring for country, as like being Sally's gap filler. The bit that you need is the bit that brings all the people together. Because this project was never going to work in isolation. It was across multiple public estate tenures, but it was also on private property, of course. And most of the the damage that people were jumping up and down about was the need to refurbish farms past pig invasion. And you can see how big an issue it is. We don't put pig collar data on here because we don't want any hunters to get an idea of where it is. So this is sort of like abstracted, but you can see a sow in Green's home range is quite small comparative to the boar, like I was saying. And the red line is from colac to forest. Boars are moving that far. So the only way to be effective in managing them is for a network of people to come together and do it. I think the program is quite effective. It's still ongoing and pigs are harder to find. I didn't expect it to be that successful. And the risk with a species like pigs is enormous. They particularly like wet areas. We have beautiful rivers, some of them protected entirely from hard-hooved animals except for feral species, and pigs make a mess of the place. I'm going to speak briefly to the Resilient Forest Project, because again, it's something that the Conservation Ecology Centre is doing a very similar. It's funny when you flog someone else's slides without asking them, Claire, you also get their notes, which I could just read it if you want. Good morning, everyone. I hope you've all had a coffee. No. I didn't know I'd be able to do that, Claire. I guess what I wanted to talk about is we're trying to understand. We've got some beautiful forests in the Otways. In particular, we have a large amount of forest that is, looks to the casual person driving by as established, mature forest, but in reality, a lot of it is still recovering from past harvesting regimes. We're trying to understand how we can make them as resilient as we possibly can to climate changes, which are ongoing and inevitable and have been going forever, but they're happening very rapidly, and what that looks like. And the first part of that program that the Conservation Ecology Centre has led with DECA is to try and understand what people who live in these communities understand of the forest, but also what they want from them. And it's a really exciting program because it allows us to look at not only the way we've managed forests in the past, but to try and apply this holistic and biocultural lens. What are the cultural values of these forests? Or what were the cultural values of these forests before we made such an awful mess of them? It's led to collaborations like this, where we're looking at fire history across what we call the northern ramps of the Otways. This is simply a map of an experiment we surveyed in last spring, where we're basically looking at or evaluating a DECA program where low intensity fire has been applied to some of the drier ridges of the north of the Otways at relatively frequent fire frequencies. They've created a real mosaic of different fire histories. And so we're able to evaluate the difference between no fire twice in twice in 3 or 4 years versus twice in 10 years. So we'll get a real understanding of the difference of the intervals between fire, which is exciting. We also know that there's a lot of food and medicine plants in that country, and they seem to be released by some of these fire interventions. So it'll be really exciting to see what we find. And because it seems to be the flavour of the day, we also, myself and some colleagues here, have attracted some funding to build basically a state and transition model for some of these forests. We're going to do that to understand the structure of the forest, but also the implicit cultural, biodiversity and fire hazard values within the states of the forest that we identify. We stole the people, like the images of the people from the NESP, so that's the Environment Science Program, Resilient Landscapes Hub from Western Australia. So that's why they look very northern blackfella if you look at the people. I don't know how clear that is, but anyway, that's basically what we're going to do. And we're really excited because we should be able to identify across the landscape where each of these states exist. What are the biodiversity values of each of these states? How can we move between these states, or what processes will drive those movements? And what cultural values does each of those states hold as well? And at the end of it, Sarah's going to come and do some really fancy maths that I will never need to understand, to look at how much fire hazard does that change as we move between states. That is all I have time to speak about today. And you don't have time to ask me questions because I got to 29 minutes and 55 seconds.